I call the Honourable Member Denise Roach.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Tēnā koe, Ms. Roach.
Tēnā koe. Tēnā koutou ki te whare. Gamble-free day was Sunday, just past. It's an opportunity to raise awareness about problem gambling and the harm that gambling can do to families and to our communities. And under ordinary other circumstances, it would have fitted well with this bill, but those circumstances have changed because this bill has changed. It's no longer focused on gambling harm reduction. Let's review what this bill set out to achieve. It was to give councils and communities the power to cut the number of pokies in their area or eliminate them altogether. It was to ensure that at least 80% of the 37.12% of the funds which are currently distributed as grants from gambling machine losses be returned to the communities where the gambling took place. It was to phase out the pokey trusts which distribute the gambling money from pokies and replace them with more accountable committees that could have been through a territorial authority or another mechanism. It was to remove racing, horse racing, from the list of charitable purposes that can use the gambling funds, and it was to introduce player tracking and pre-commit cards, enabling gamblers to put controls on the amount of time they spend and money they lose while playing pokies. Has this bill before the House done any of this? I have to say the answer is no. It has not given communities and councils more power to reduce the number of pokies in their communities. In fact, this bill has made it harder for them to do so by introducing an amendment to the original bill that will allow the transfer of pokies to other venues without losing any of their machines. And this cuts across the council's ability to use transferals as a way to implement sinking lid policies, reduce the number of pokies in their communities overall. It makes a mockery of the sinking lid policies that so many councils have introduced so far. And I note that according to the Department of Internal Affairs, in the last year, councils have been doing a really good job and the number of venues and pokies have declined. There are gaming machines, for example, decreased from 17,943 to 17,534. The second aim of the bill was to ensure that 80% of the distributable funds went back to the communities where they came from. But even a casual look at the spread of pokies across this country will show that of those current 17,534 pokey machines and pubs and clubs, most of them are concentrated in poor areas. Now, the latest gambling figures also showed that at the end of June this year, $826.3 million was lost on those pokies. The distributable funds from this, 37%, is around $275 million or so, and that money, 80% of it, that could have gone back to Otahu, Manurewa, Kawerau. But this bill won't allow that to happen. The reason given is that national organisations would be disadvantaged because they wouldn't be able to apply for funds. But heavens, there'd still be 20% of that $275 million or so. That's around $55 million. That's a hell of a big pool that national organisations could still apply to. And we have to remember that not only does this money come from poor communities, but 40% of this money comes from gamblers who have no control over their gambling behaviour. And we should look more closely at who's getting that money. The numerous rorts every year associated with dodgy grants being allocated carries on. The latest one this year was the prosecution of a couple of people involved with the Manurewa High School Rugby Academy and Counties Manukau Youth Development, who basically gave themselves grants that were supposed to be going to local rugby. Actually, it's interesting to count up how much pokey money has gone to rugby. For a non-professional sport, rugby soaks up an enormous amount of cash. In March last year, the Otago Daily Times revealed that between 2006 and 2011, the Otago Rugby Union received $5.8 million. That didn't come from Otago. And I've done some calculations about how much sport overall benefits from pokie money, and this is what I've discovered. Over the last 7 years, there have been 143,000 netball players, and netball in New Zealand has received nearly $44 million during that period. That works out to $307.60 per player. Compare that with rugby for the same time period, which had 141,000 players, 2,000 less than netballers. Over that period, their grants came to $178,602,000. That works out to $1,260 per player, per rugby player. Now, I can't figure out what that money was spent on, and I can only assume that Rugby New Zealand like to allocate each player with a pair of gold-plated rugby boots. And for all that money that was allocated to rugby, my local rugby club still holds sausage sizzles and goes for local sponsorship because they're not seeing $1,260 per player or gold-plated rugby boots, and we've got 18 pokies in our neighbourhood. And it's interesting to see that gender gap too, still playing out pokies. I guess the concentration of funds also highlights one of the other failed aspects of this bill, and that was the aim of replacing the existing pokie trusts that distribute the money with something that would be more accountable to communities. And it's not going to happen. Basically, because we experienced an all-out campaign from the pokie trusts to ensure their survival. As soon as the bill was passed its first reading, we had the two big pokie trusts, Lion Foundation and Pub Charity, use the community money that supports their existence to encourage their grant recipients to oppose the bill. It was implied to community organisations that with the demise of the existing pokie trusts, they were probably not going to get any money. Now, pokie trusts have only one purpose, and that's to distribute the pokie money for community good. That they should take it upon themselves to meddle with the democratic processes of the country by attempting to skew the results of the bill when that is completely outside their purpose is reprehensible. Pub Charity especially have had a good go at using their financial power to stifle dissent. So this bill has failed to address the dodgy distribution of grants, and I have to say, with 30,000 submissions, the pokie trusts have won. This bill also failed to remove horse racing from the list of purposes that can use the money generated from the pokie gambling. That means that racehorse owners can still receive stake money from pokie gambling, like some of the other worthy charities that receive money from pokie gambling. It's an anomaly, but it remains. And finally, this bill has failed in harm minimisation. This bill will not introduce pre-commit cards or real-time player tracking. These are the only measures that can identify and control gambling behaviour before the gamblers lose everything they've got. The Minister has talked about regulation and putting some of these measures into the regulations as an alternative to actually having it in the bill. Well, regulation means that it's at the whim of the Minister. I guess he's suggesting we can trust him. But it's also through consultation with the industry. We have already lost that battle. We've lost that battle, Mr. Flavel. The industry won. This industry is insatiable. And finally, the last thing I want to say about this bill, and I agree with the Problem Gambling Foundation and the Salvation Army who say that this bill will make matters worse. But finally, this bill doesn't do what Mr. Flavel really wanted it to do when he spoke in the House in its introduction last year, and that was address the terrible statistics that show that Māori are most harmed by these machines, Or as he said, that they were colonised by this machine, these machines and this industry. Mr Speaker, I maintain that the member should have pulled this bill, and it's a sad end to a hopeful start. I will.
I call the Honourable Ruth Dyson.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker.